the sacrifice of the people of Jamaica through a system of consensus building. So the unions, the financial sector, the manufacturing sector, and just the general people understood that the country was at a point of crisis.
There is a number that the International Monetary Fund does not want to talk about right now. A number that economic textbooks from 15 years ago said was mathematically impossible for a country like Jamaica. A number so far outside what the experts predicted that when it first appeared in the official data, analysts genuinely questioned whether it had been recorded correctly. That number is this. Jamaica has cut its national debt from 147% of GDP down to 72% in under a decade. Not with oil money, not with a mineral windfall, not with a bailout from a wealthy patron. Jamaica did it through fiscal discipline, structural reform, and the deliberate, grinding, unglamorous work of rebuilding a broken economy from the inside out. But here is what makes that number explosive. That is not even the most remarkable thing Jamaica has done in recent years. Sit with that for a moment, because what I am about to show you over the next 30 minutes is a picture of an island nation that is quietly, methodically, and without nearly enough credit, doing things that nobody in international finance or development economics thought a small Caribbean country could do. Jamaica is building roads while simultaneously paying down debt. Jamaica is attracting foreign investment while simultaneously telling foreign investors what the terms will be. Jamaica is rebuilding from the most destructive hurricane in its modern history, while simultaneously posting infrastructure completions. And Jamaica is doing all of this while the diaspora, the Jamaicans in London and Toronto and New York and Miami, who sent nearly $3.5 billion home in 2025, watches and wonders whether this is finally the moment their island becomes what it always should have been. This is a Caribbean Journey production. This is the new Caribbean economy. And this is the Jamaica story that mainstream media has almost entirely missed. Let us begin with the context, because without the context, the achievement means nothing. To understand what Jamaica is doing right now, you need to understand what Jamaica was dealing with just 12 years ago. In 2013, Jamaica entered into one of the most severe economic adjustment programs the Western Hemisphere had seen in decades. The country's debt load was catastrophic. Debt servicing alone was consuming nearly half of all government revenues. Every dollar the Jamaican government collected, 50 cents went straight out the door to creditors before a single road could be patched, a single nurse could be paid, or a single child could receive a school lunch. The economy was not growing. It had not meaningfully grown in over a decade. Unemployment was stuck in double digits. The Jamaican dollar was weakening. Capital was leaving. And internationally, Jamaica was viewed as a cautionary tale. Proof, some economists argued, that small island developing states could not manage their own fiscal affairs without perpetual external intervention. There was a phrase that circulated in development circles about Jamaica at that time. They called it the treadmill economy. The country ran as hard as it could and never moved forward. Tax revenues rose, but debt service absorbed the gains. Tourism boomed, but the profits concentrated in hotel enclaves while rural parishes stayed poor. Remittances flowed in, but they paid for consumption rather than investment. Jamaica was surviving. It was not transforming. And then, quietly, something shifted. The shift did not come with a dramatic announcement. There was no single moment, no ribbon cutting, no presidential speech that historians will point to as the turning point. What happened in Jamaica was slower and harder and far less cinematic than that. It was a series of decisions, many of them deeply unpopular, that accumulated over years into something that now looks from the outside almost like a miracle. The first decision was fiscal consolidation. Jamaica agreed with the IMF on a program that required consistent primary fiscal surpluses, meaning the government had to collect more in taxes than it spent on everything except debt interest. This is extraordinarily difficult to sustain politically. It means cutting spending when your voters need services. It means raising taxes when your businesses are already struggling. It means saying no repeatedly to popular demands and absorbing the political cost of doing so. Multiple Jamaican administrations, across party lines, maintain that discipline. The Jamaica Labour Party and the People's National Party, rivals since independence, both held the line. That bipartisan commitment to fiscal responsibility is something that most of the Caribbean, and frankly most of the developing world, has never managed to sustain. The result of that discipline is the debt number I opened with: 147% of GDP in 2013, 72% by the mid-2020s. The IMF has held up Jamaica as one of its most successful adjustment stories anywhere in the world. Former IMF Managing Director Christine Lagarde visited Kingston and praised the Jamaican program in terms usually reserved for much larger economies. The country's debt trajectory is now on a path toward the 60% target that economists consider manageable for a developing nation. Jamaica crossed a threshold that its own citizens, exhausted by years of austerity, barely allowed themselves to believe was reachable. But fiscal consolidation is the foundation. What Jamaica built on top of that foundation is where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary. Because while it was paying down debt, Jamaica was also building things. And the scale of what it is building would surprise even those who follow Caribbean economics closely. Let us talk about roads first, because roads are where the transformation becomes visible. The SPARK program, the Southern Coastal Highway Improvement Project, is one of the most significant infrastructure undertakings in Jamaican history. This is not a patch and repair operation. This is the construction of a modern highway corridor connecting Kingston to the western parishes, passing through communities that have been economically cut off from the capital for generations. When completed, the journey from Kingston to Black River in St. Elizabeth, a trip that currently takes 2.5 to 3 hours on the existing road, will be reduced to under 90 minutes. That does not sound significant until you understand what it means for a small farmer in St. Elizabeth who currently loses a quarter of his produce to spoilage and delay before it reaches Kingston markets. It does not sound significant until you understand what it means for a factory in Portmore that currently cannot attract workers from the western parishes because the commute is simply too long. Infrastructure in a country like Jamaica is not just about moving cars. It is about economic geography. It is about which communities get access to opportunity and which ones remain stranded. The financing for SPARK is itself a signal of Jamaica's changed position in the world. The project is drawing on a combination of China Exim Bank financing, Inter-American Development Bank support, and domestic contributions. Jamaica is not relying on any single partner. It is managing a portfolio of international relationships with a sophistication that would have been unimaginable for a country in its fiscal position a decade ago. That is not an accident. That is strategy. And SPARK is one project among several running simultaneously. The upgrade of the Norman Manley International Airport in Kingston is proceeding. The expansion of Sangster International Airport in Montego Bay, already one of the busiest airports in the English-speaking Caribbean, is advancing. The proposed Ian Fleming International Airport redevelopment in St. Mary is moving through planning. And the most ambitious proposal of all, the Greenfield Airport at Little London in Westmoreland, remains on the table as Jamaica positions its western parishes for a tourism and logistics future that does not currently exist. Think about what it means to be expanding airport capacity at multiple locations simultaneously while also building highway corridors and managing sovereign debt reduction. Most countries of Jamaica's size and income level are doing one of those things, perhaps two, and struggling. Jamaica is attempting all of them at once. That is either reckless overreach or genuine transformation, and the data so far suggests it is the latter. Now here is where the diaspora in this audience needs to pay very close attention, because this next part affects you directly. Jamaica's remittance story has changed fundamentally. For decades, remittances flowed into Jamaica and were treated essentially as a social safety valve. Families abroad sent money home to cover school fees, medical bills, groceries, and rent. The money was consumed, it rarely invested. The Jamaican government understood this and largely accepted it because the alternative, without remittances, was a social crisis it could not absorb. Remittances were survival money, not development money. That framing is now changing. In 2025, Jamaica received approximately $3.49 billion in remittances. That figure represents close to 20% of the country's entire gross domestic product. There is almost no other country in the Western Hemisphere, and very few in the world, for which remittances represent that proportion of the national economy. Jamaica's diaspora is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most economically consequential overseas communities relative to home country size that exist anywhere on Earth. And the Jamaican government has begun carefully to think about how to harness that capital for investment rather than just consumption. Programs designed to channel diaspora funds into productive investment in housing, in small business, in infrastructure bonds are being developed. The Bank of Jamaica has been working on regulatory frameworks that make it easier for Jamaicans abroad to invest formally in the domestic economy, rather than sending informal transfers to family members. Afrexim Bank, the Pan-African Export-Import Bank, formalized a relationship with Jamaica in mid-2025 that unlocked $1.5 billion in dedicated financing, part of a $3 billion CARICOM-wide program. This is money that does not come with the political conditions that Western financing has traditionally attached. It is trade and development capital, and it connects Jamaica to a much broader financial ecosystem than the traditional Washington-London-Miami triangle. For Jamaicans in New York, in London, in Toronto, what this means is that the island your parents or grandparents left because there was no opportunity is being systematically rebuilt into a place where investment makes economic sense. The question is no longer whether Jamaica can attract money. The question is whether the regulatory environment, the security conditions, and the governance structures can match the ambition of the infrastructure program. And that brings us to the hardest part of this story, because Jamaica's transformation is real, and it is measurable, and it is impressive, but it is also incomplete, and the gaps are important. Hurricane Melissa hit Jamaica's western parishes in October 2025 as a Category 5 storm. The World Bank estimated damage at approximately $8.8 billion, roughly 41% of Jamaica's entire 2024 GDP. In a single event, a storm erased almost half a year of the country's economic output. 156,000 dwellings were damaged. 24,000 were total losses. The tourism infrastructure across Westmoreland, Hanover, and parts of St. James, the very western corridor that the Spark Highway is designed to unlock, was devastated. Hotels that had just completed renovations were gutted. Fishing communities that had recently received infrastructure support were wiped out. The Planning Institute of Jamaica projected an 11 to 13% GDP contraction in the final quarter of 2025. Tourism arrivals, which had reached over 4 million visitors in 2023, fell sharply. Foreign exchange earnings from the sector dropped in the immediate aftermath. And here is what happened next. Something that reveals exactly who Jamaicans are, in the diaspora and on the island. In November 2025, in the immediate weeks after Hurricane Melissa, remittance flows actually dipped, not because the diaspora stopped caring, but because the storm disrupted the financial infrastructure through which money flows. Banking services were interrupted, money transfer agents were closed, roads were impassable, the mechanisms of giving were temporarily broken. But by December 2025, net remittance inflows to Jamaica climbed to $315.3 million, a 13.6% increase compared to December 2024, the largest single monthly jump recorded during the entire year, driven by a $36.2 million increase in gross inflows, as Jamaicans in New York and London and Toronto opened their wallets and sent everything they could. When their country needed them, the diaspora answered. The people the United States government described as high risk of public dependency, those precise words used to justify a visa processing pause for Jamaicans in early 2026, sent hundreds of millions of dollars to rebuild homes that were not theirs, in communities they may not have visited in years, for families they may know only through WhatsApp calls and photographs. That is not dependency. That is solidarity. That is the Jamaican diaspora doing exactly what it has always done, carrying the island on its back when the island cannot carry itself. By late 2025, approximately 70% of Jamaica's hotel room inventory was back online. Projections suggested 80% restoration by February 2026, with a full recovery trajectory toward the end of the year. That recovery speed, from a Category 5 hurricane, is itself a form of achievement that deserves recognition. But the hurricane also exposed something that Jamaica's leadership cannot afford to ignore. The country is building a modern infrastructure network in a hurricane corridor. The Spark Highway, the airport expansions, the coastal road improvements, all of them are vulnerable to exactly the kind of storm that hit in October 2025. Climate resilience cannot be an afterthought in Jamaica's infrastructure program. It has to be baked into every project from the first drawing. Flood resistance, elevated road design, storm-hardened terminal buildings, sea-level planning. These are not optional extras for a Caribbean island. They are existential necessities. The Inter-American Development Bank and the Caribbean Development Bank have both been pushing this conversation with Jamaica's planning authorities. The question of whether Jamaica can afford climate-resilient infrastructure on top of everything else it is trying to do is real. The answer, if the fiscal consolidation continues and the investment flows hold, is probably yes. But it requires decisions to be made now, in the design phase, before the concrete is poured and the choices become permanent. Now let us talk about something that the competitors in this space rarely cover with enough honesty: the contradiction at the heart of Jamaica's transformation. Jamaica is building infrastructure at a pace that has not been seen in the island's post-independence history. Roads, airports, ports, highways. The numbers are real. The concrete is real. The jobs created in construction are real. And simultaneously, Jamaica's public health system is under severe strain. Cornwall Regional Hospital in Montego Bay, the principal public hospital serving Western Jamaica, the same Western Jamaica now receiving billions of dollars in road investment, has been operating under conditions that the country's own health authorities have described as critically deficient. Equipment failures, staff shortages, physical infrastructure decay, and a brain drain of medical professionals leaving for the United Kingdom, Canada, and the United States have created a situation where the roads leading to the hospital are being modernized while the hospital itself struggles to provide consistent care. This is not a hypothetical tension. It is a documented one. The government has acknowledged it. The SCIP program, the Southern Caribbean Hospital Improvement Program, or more precisely within the Jamaican context, the effort to address infrastructure deficiencies at Cornwall Regional, has been progressing, but the pace of healthcare investment has lagged behind the pace of road investment in a way that ordinary Jamaicans notice and resent. The nurse in Montego Bay who drives to work on the new highway and then clocks in at a hospital where the radiology equipment has been broken for 6 months is not going to celebrate the road. The child whose family can now drive to Kingston in 90 minutes but cannot get a functioning X-ray at the nearest public hospital is not going to celebrate the highway. Development that is visible and tangible and photographable. Roads, airports, bridges, attracts investment, generates political capital, and produces ribbon cuttings. Development that keeps a hospital functioning, that pays a radiologist enough not to emigrate, that replaces aging diagnostic equipment, that is quieter, harder to photograph, and far more difficult to finance through the kinds of international loans that roads attract. This is the central challenge of Jamaica's transformation moment. It is not whether Jamaica can build. It is whether Jamaica can build everything that needs to be built in the right sequence, without allowing the visible infrastructure wins to obscure the invisible human infrastructure failures. Prime Minister Holness has spoken about this directly. The government has committed to the SCIP program. Funding commitments have been made, procurement processes have been initiated, but the gap between commitment and delivery in healthcare infrastructure has been a recurring feature of Jamaican governance across multiple administrations and multiple parties. The diaspora watching from abroad, many of whom have experienced both the modern Norman Manley Airport terminal and the frustrating reality of public health care when they visit home, understands this contradiction viscerally. The honest assessment is this: Jamaica's fiscal transformation and infrastructure program are genuine and impressive. The healthcare system urgently needs the same level of political will and investment urgency that the road program has received. Both things are true simultaneously. Let us now talk about the economic diversification story, because this is where the long-term future of Jamaica's transformation will be determined. Jamaica's economy has historically rested on 4 pillars: tourism, remittances, bauxite and alumina exports, and agriculture. Each of these pillars has structural vulnerabilities. Tourism is weather-dependent, as Hurricane Melissa demonstrated brutally. Remittances are diaspora-dependent. and the diaspora's willingness and ability to send money home fluctuates with economic conditions in the countries where Jamaicans live. Bauxite and alumina are commodity markets, subject to price cycles that Jamaica cannot control. And agriculture, though vital to food security and rural employment, has struggled to compete internationally as global commodity prices shift. Jamaica's BPO sector, business process outsourcing, is the fifth pillar that has been growing quietly for the better part of 15 years, and is now beginning to demand the attention it deserves. Jamaica today hosts operations for some of the world's largest companies: call centers, data processing, customer service, back-office operations, and increasingly higher-value functions like medical coding, financial analysis, and technology support. The sector employs over 40,000 Jamaicans and generates well over $600 million in annual foreign exchange earnings. It has been growing at between 10 and 15% annually in recent years. It is, by any measure, one of the genuine economic success stories on the island, and it has advantages that are difficult to replicate. Jamaica is in the same time zone as the eastern United States seaboard. Jamaicans speak English as a first language. The country has relatively good telecommunications infrastructure by Caribbean standards. Labor costs are significantly lower than in the United States or the United Kingdom, while the workforce is educated and increasingly specifically trained for BPO work. The government has invested in designated economic zones for the industry. The Urban Development Corporation has developed facilities that attract international operators. The question for Jamaica's BPO future is whether the sector can move up the value chain fast enough. Entry-level call center work is mobile. Companies will move it to wherever costs are lowest. What retains BPO investment and grows it into higher-paying jobs is the development of specialized skills: medical coding, legal process outsourcing, technology support, financial services that require training, certification, and institutional knowledge. Jamaica has begun this transition, but the pace matters. The window of competitive advantage in entry-level BPO is narrowing as artificial intelligence begins to automate the simplest customer service functions. Jamaica needs to move up the ladder before the bottom rungs disappear. The Kingston port story is another dimension of Jamaica's diversification that deserves more attention than it typically receives. Kingston Container Terminal is one of the busiest transshipment hubs in the Caribbean. It is not primarily a port that serves Jamaican imports and exports. Jamaica's own trade volume is not large enough to make it globally significant. Kingston's port is a transshipment port, meaning it serves as a relay point where cargo from large vessels is transferred to smaller ships for distribution throughout the Caribbean and the Americas. Its geographic position in the center of major Atlantic shipping lanes gives it a structural advantage that is very difficult to replicate. The deep natural harbor of Kingston Harbor is one of the largest and most naturally protected in the Western Hemisphere. The ambition, which has been discussed for years and is now being pursued with greater seriousness, is to position Kingston as a carbon-neutral transshipment hub and logistics center. Container shipping is under enormous pressure globally to decarbonize. The International Maritime Organization has set increasingly aggressive targets for emissions reductions in shipping. Ports that can offer green logistics, renewable energy for terminal operations, electric equipment, low-carbon fuel bunkering for vessels will have a competitive advantage in the coming decade as shipping companies seek to meet their own decarbonization commitments. Jamaica has the renewable energy resources to pursue this. The island has been rapidly expanding its solar and wind generation capacity. Renewable energy now represents a growing proportion of Jamaica's electricity mix after decades of near-total dependence on imported petroleum. If the trajectory continues, Jamaica could be generating a significant majority of its electricity from renewable sources within the next decade. The combination of a strategically located deep-water port and competitive renewable energy infrastructure is exactly the kind of asset base that could attract the premium logistics investment that would transform Kingston's role in global trade. This is not fantasy. This is a roadmap that exists in Jamaica's own planning documents and has been discussed with potential international partners. The gap between roadmap and reality is investment, political will, and execution, the same gaps that exist in every ambitious development plan. But the underlying logic is sound. Now let us pull back and look at the geopolitical frame, because Jamaica's transformation is happening in a specific international context that shapes what is possible and what is dangerous. Jamaica sits in the Caribbean, which the United States has historically treated as its strategic backyard. For decades, Caribbean nations had essentially one option: align with Washington, accept the terms that Washington set, and benefit from market access, tourism flows, and security cooperation in return. The alternative, pushing back, seeking other partners, asserting independent foreign policy, was described as reckless, as inviting economic punishment, as prioritizing pride over prosperity. That calculus is changing, and Jamaica is one of the countries at the center of the change. The visa processing pause announced by the United States in January 2026, affecting Jamaicans as part of a broader suspension across 75 countries, landed in Kingston like a direct message. Jamaica's Foreign Affairs Minister Kamina Johnson-Smith engaged diplomatically. Prime Minister Andrew Holness was measured and careful in his public response. "We will pursue diplomatic channels, but we are going to pursue even more, making our country the place of choice to live, work, do business, raise families, and retire in paradise." That statement is worth reading again slowly. It is not defiance. It is a reorientation. It is a leader saying, "We will fight for what we can through diplomacy, and we will build what we can through our own hands." The U.S. tariff imposition in April 2025, 10% on Jamaican exports as part of the Liberation Day announcement, threatened the preferential market access arrangements that the Caribbean Basin Initiative had provided since 1984. For over 40 years, Jamaican exporters had access to American markets on terms that allowed small-scale production to be commercially viable. A 10% tariff changes the economics of rum, coffee, agricultural products, and manufactured goods in ways that hurt the smallest, most vulnerable producers first. And yet the response from Jamaica's government was not panic. It was strategic navigation. CARICOM, as a bloc, began coordinating. Bilateral conversations with Washington were pursued. The Afreximbank relationship was formalized. Chinese infrastructure investment continued. And Jamaica, carefully, without severing anything, began demonstrating that it had more options than Washington perhaps assumed. This matters for the diaspora because it means the political relationship between Jamaica and the United States is no longer simply one of patron and client. It is becoming something more complex, more contested, and ultimately more respectful. Small nations that have alternatives negotiate differently from small nations that have none. Jamaica is deliberately, systematically, and quite quietly acquiring alternatives. The congressman from Florida, who publicly threatened Jamaica with consequences for Prime Minister Holness's measured statement about Cuba's humanitarian situation. That threat revealed something important. It revealed that some in Washington still operate with the assumption that Caribbean nations can be publicly threatened and publicly humiliated, without cost, without consequence, and without response. The speed and breadth of the reaction in the Caribbean diaspora across social media, the editorial condemnation in regional press, the formal diplomatic rebuke, all of it suggested that assumption is increasingly incorrect. The Caribbean is no longer a region without a voice. It is a region that is finding its voice, amplified by millions of diaspora members in cities across the English-speaking world who vote, who organize, who donate, and who pay very close attention to how their home countries are treated by the governments of the countries where they now live. For Jamaicans in the United Kingdom, this moment carries additional weight. The remittance tax proposal in the U.S., the provision within the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that proposed levying a tax on outbound money transfers, would, even at the reduced 1% rate, extract $35 million annually from funds that Jamaican Americans earned, paid taxes on, and chose to send to their families. The language of sovereignty and the language of family intersect here in a way that is impossible to separate. The money Jamaicans abroad send home is not foreign aid. It is not development assistance. It is family income, redistributed across borders by people who left their country to build a better life and choose to share it with the people they left behind. Dr. Karen Dunkley, a former Jamaica Global Diaspora Council member, described the proposed remittance tax as not just bad economics but a betrayal of shared humanity. That phrase captures something real. The relationship between the Jamaican diaspora and the Jamaican homeland is not a transaction. It is a covenant. And any government that treats it as a transaction to be taxed for revenue is misunderstanding what it is dealing with. So where does all of this leave Jamaica in 2026? Here is the honest picture. Jamaica has achieved something in fiscal management that most developing countries fail to achieve. and that deserves global recognition far beyond what it has received. The debt reduction is real. The primary surplus discipline is real. The IMF relationship, which was once a symbol of national humiliation, has been transformed into something approaching genuine partnership because Jamaica did what it said it would do. That is rare, that is hard, and that is foundational to everything else. Jamaica is building infrastructure at a scale and pace that will transform the physical geography of economic opportunity on the island. The Spark Highway, the airport upgrades, the port ambitions, the renewable energy transition, these are not plans on paper. They are projects under construction or in advanced procurement. The western parishes that Hurricane Melissa devastated are also the parishes that the infrastructure investment is most directly designed to serve. The reconstruction and the development are happening simultaneously, which is exactly what resilience looks like in practice. Jamaica has diversified its international financial relationships in ways that give it real leverage it did not have a decade ago. Chinese investment, Afrexim Bank financing, IDB support, and domestic fiscal space are a more robust portfolio than dependence on any single external partner. And Jamaica's diaspora, $3.5 billion a year. Jamaicans in every major English-speaking city on earth, a community that sent hundreds of millions of dollars home in the month after a Category 5 hurricane, remains the most powerful economic and political asset that the island possesses. The question of how to channel that asset more deliberately toward investment rather than just consumption is one that Jamaica's policymakers are working on urgently. The answer will shape the next decade of the country's development. But the gaps are real too. Healthcare infrastructure has not kept pace with road infrastructure. Cornwall Regional Hospital is the most visible symbol of this gap, but it is not the only one. The brain drain of nurses, doctors, and allied health professionals to the United Kingdom and North America is accelerating in the years since the COVID-19 pandemic, and the island cannot build its way to health equity with highways if the human capital required to staff the hospitals is leaving on the same planes that bring the tourists. Crime remains the most persistent drag on Jamaica's economic potential, not just because of its direct human cost, which is enormous and devastating, but because of its structural economic effect. It raises the cost of doing business, deters investment, drives emigration of exactly the skilled workers the country needs to retain, and consumes public resources in policing, prosecution, and incarceration that could otherwise be invested in education, health, or infrastructure. The Zone of Special Operations Program and other security interventions have had localized successes. The question of whether Jamaica can achieve the sustained nationwide reduction in violent crime that would unlock the full economic potential of everything else it is building. That question does not yet have a definitive answer. And climate vulnerability is not a future risk. It is a present reality. Hurricane Melissa proved that in October 2025, with 41% of GDP erased in a single event. Every infrastructure project Jamaica undertakes, every hotel that opens, every highway that is paved, every terminal that is built, exists under the permanent shadow of the Atlantic hurricane season. Climate resilience is not optional for Jamaica. It is the single most important design specification for every piece of public infrastructure on the island. So is Jamaica doing what nobody thought possible? Yes, the fiscal transformation alone earns that description. The combination of debt reduction, infrastructure investment, economic diversification, and diplomatic repositioning, all happening simultaneously, represents an achievement that deserves to be understood, celebrated, and studied by every small island developing state in the Caribbean and beyond. But what nobody thought possible cannot become complacency. The transformation is real and it is incomplete. The foundation is stronger than it has ever been, and the structure built on top of it is still vulnerable. Jamaica is not yet the country it is building toward. It is the country that is building. And for the Jamaican diaspora watching from abroad, from the nurses in London, to the entrepreneurs in New York, to the teachers in Toronto, that building is something you are part of. Every remittance sent, every vote in an overseas diaspora consultation, every conversation at a yard party where someone asks, but what is really happening back home? That is a piece of this story. The transformation of Jamaica is not happening to you from a distance. You are one of its primary engines. The island that your parents or grandparents left because there was nothing there for them is not the island that exists today. It is not yet the island it needs to become, but it is moving, it is building, And in the context of what was predicted for it, in the context of where it came from, in the context of what small island developing states in the Caribbean have historically been able to achieve, Jamaica is doing what nobody thought possible. This has been Caribbean Journey. This is the new Caribbean economy. If this video gave you something to think about, if it showed you a dimension of Jamaica that you had not seen before, share it with someone in the diaspora who needs to hear this story. Subscribe so you never miss an episode of the new Caribbean Economy series, because the Caribbean is changing faster than any international headline will tell you, and we are here to cover every step of it. Drop a comment below and tell me, do you think Jamaica's infrastructure investment is outpacing its investment in people? Is the healthcare gap the island's most urgent challenge, or is it crime? Because this conversation is bigger than any single video, and your perspective as someone connected to this region is something I genuinely want to hear. Until next time, this is Caribbean Journey. Stay curious, stay connected, and never underestimate what this region is capable of.